In 1887, inside a rolling mill in Hubbard, Ohio, an engineer named Griffith Phillips was oiling an ore-crushing machine when his loose clothing caught on the spinning cogwheels. Before anyone could react, the gears dragged him in. A newspaper reported that he was mangled out of all semblance of humanity, the flesh adhering to the cogs. There was no emergency stop, no guard between man and machine, just rotating iron and the body it consumed. This was not an isolated horror. This was Tuesday in the American steel industry. Rolling mills were the backbone of industrial progress, the machines that shaped raw iron into rails, beams, and the skeleton of a growing nation. But they were also factories of mutilation. Workers fed glowing metal through massive rollers by hand, caught it with tongs as it shot out at lethal speed, and sometimes wrapped red-hot iron around their own bodies just to keep production moving. The heat could blind you, the rollers could flatten you, and if neither one killed you, the pace eventually would. This is the story of the rolling mill, a machine so essential to civilization that we built entire cities around it, and so dangerous that the men who operated it rarely lived to see old age. Rolling mills did not look like killers. They looked like progress. The concept was simple. Take a piece of heated iron, pass it between two heavy rotating cylinders, and squeeze it thinner. Repeat the process through successive passes, and raw metal becomes something useful. Rails, beams, sheets, the skeleton of a nation. In 1783, an English ironmaster named Henry Cort patented grooved rolling, a method that shaped iron bars using specially cut cylinders. That single invention changed everything. A rolling mill could produce 15 times more output per day than a forge hammer. 15 times. What once took a week now took hours. The Industrial Revolution had found its engine. By the mid-1800s, rolling mills were spreading across Europe and North America. They clustered along rivers and rail lines in places like Pittsburgh, Youngstown, and Birmingham. Entire cities grew around them. And why not? The demand was endless. Railroads needed rails, bridges needed beams, factories needed sheet metal. The world was building itself out of iron, and rolling mills were the only machines fast enough to keep up. I need to pause here for just a moment. If you find industrial history like this fascinating, I would be grateful if you could subscribe and let me know in the comments which disasters I should investigate next. Now back to the story. By 1890, American rolling mills alone were processing over 5 million tons of iron and steel per year. That number climbed to 8 million tons by the end of the decade. Every pound of it passed through rotating cylinders, squeezed and shaped by machines that never stopped running. The process began in puddling furnaces, where workers stirred molten iron to burn off impurities. The refined metal was then carried to the rolling mill, where it entered the first set of rolls glowing red. Each pass reduced its thickness. Each pass brought it closer to its final shape. The rollers turned constantly, powered by steam engines that roared through 12-hour shifts and beyond. This was the machine that built modern infrastructure. Without rolling mills, there were no transcontinental railroads, no suspension bridges, no steel-framed skyscrapers. But the same machines that built America were grinding through its workers at a pace the nation would rather not count. And as we'll soon find out, the numbers were staggering. The scale of the rolling mill industry is difficult to comprehend today. By the late 1800s, thousands of mills operated across North America and Europe. The largest employed hundreds of workers. Some employed thousands. These were not small workshops tucked away in industrial corners. They were cities within cities, entire economies built around the endless rotation of iron cylinders. The production numbers tell part of the story. By 1899, American rolling mills were processing over 8 million tons of iron and steel annually. That works out to more than 160,000 tons per week. Every single pound of that metal was handled by human beings working in conditions that would be unthinkable today. Here's the thing about rolling mills. They didn't just produce steel. They produced widows. Workers in these facilities labored for 12 hours, at a stretch 7 days a week. But that was just the standard shift. Every other Sunday brought what workers called the turnaround. To rotate between day and night crews, a man had to work 24 hours straight. No breaks, no relief, just a full day and night standing next to molten metal, feeding glowing iron through machines that never stopped. Could you imagine that? 24 consecutive hours in temperatures that could melt flesh, surrounded by equipment designed to crush and flatten anything that passed between its rollers. For this, workers earned between $1.30 and $5 per day. The pay varied by skill and by region, but the risk was universal. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no employer liability. If you lost a hand, you lost your job. If you lost your life, your family lost everything. James Davis knew this world intimately. He started as a puddler in the Sharon Iron Works and eventually became Secretary of Labor under 3 presidents. But he never forgot what the mills were really like. "Life in these mills is a terrible life," he wrote. "Men are ground down to scrap and thrown out as wreckage." Ground down to scrap. That phrase stays with me, because it was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of what happened to human bodies in these facilities. The rolling mill took iron and transformed it into something useful. It took men and did the same, extracting labor until nothing remained. And yet the workers kept coming. Immigrants from Wales, Germany, Ireland, and Eastern Europe filled the mill towns, desperate for wages that might build a better life. They accepted the hours. They accepted the heat. They accepted the risk because there was no alternative. But the true danger was not just the hours or the heat. It was what happened when human flesh met rotating iron. And the physics of that encounter were merciless. A rolling mill kills through physics. The mechanism is simple, elegant, and utterly unforgiving. Understanding it requires understanding one concept: the nip point. The nip point is the gap where 2 rotating cylinders meet. When metal passes through, the rollers grip it and pull it forward. The pressure is immense, thousands of pounds per square inch, enough force to flatten solid iron into thin sheets. Now consider what that same force does to a human hand. Think of an old household wringer, the kind once used to squeeze water from wet clothes. 2 rollers press together while a crank turns them. Feed in a shirt, and it gets pulled through. Now imagine that wringer weighing several tons. Imagine it spinning continuously, powered by a steam engine that never stops. Imagine standing inches away from it for 12 hours straight. That was the rolling mill. Even slow-moving rollers could grab loose clothing, a dangling glove, or a strand of hair. Once contact was made, the rotation did the rest. The machine pulled you in before you could scream, before anyone could react, before the thought of escape even formed in your mind. But the rollers were only part of the danger. The metal itself was lethal. Iron entered the rolling mill at temperatures between 2400 and 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. At that heat, the metal glowed bright orange. Touching it meant burns to the bone. Getting splashed meant worse. Workers handled this material with tongs, catching bars of glowing iron as they shot out of the rollers at speed. Fractions of a second separated a successful catch from a catastrophic miss, and the bars kept getting longer. Here's what I find truly insane. Before mechanization, workers used a technique called looping. Each pass through the rollers elongated the bar. To keep production moving, a worker called the catcher would grab the emerging metal, loop it around his own body, and feed it back into the next pass. The loops on the mill floor grew longer with each cycle. The iron stayed hot enough to burn through leather. Could you imagine wrapping red-hot metal around yourself as part of your job? There were no guards between workers and the machinery. Exposed rollers, spinning gears, whipping belts, and rotating pulleys surrounded them on all sides. There were no emergency stops either. Cutting power meant losing an entire heat of iron. The cost of shutting down exceeded the cost of a man's hand. Production always won. The math was brutally simple. Rotating mass plus unguarded machinery plus human bodies in close proximity equals disaster. The only variable was when, not if, and disasters came with horrifying regularity. The danger was obvious. Everyone who worked in a rolling mill understood the risks. So why did nothing change? The answer lies in a system designed to make accidents invisible and blame inevitable. Before 1884, every piece of rolling stock was fed into the machines by hand. Workers used hooks and tongs to guide glowing metal through the rollers, standing close enough to feel the heat radiating off the iron. There were no mechanical feeders, no automated tables, just human hands doing work that human hands were never meant to do. Why not install guards? Why not create distance between workers and machinery? Because stopping cost money. Shutting down a heat-wasted fuel wasted time and wasted product. A single interruption could cost more than a worker earned in a month. Production pressure was relentless, and every safety measure that slowed output was a safety measure that would never be installed. But the real protection for mill owners was not efficiency, it was the law. Under common law, an injured worker had to prove employer negligence to receive any compensation. That meant hiring lawyers, gathering evidence, and fighting corporations with unlimited resources. For an immigrant earning $1.30 per day, this was impossible. The legal system was not designed for protection. It was designed for exclusion. And it got worse. Two doctrines ensured that workers almost never won. The first was assumption of risk. By accepting employment, a worker was considered to have accepted all dangers that came with the job. You knew the rollers could crush you. You took the job anyway. Your fault. The second was the fellow servant rule. If another worker contributed to your accident in any way, the employer bore no liability, even if the machinery was defective, even if no guards existed, even if management ordered unsafe practices. One co-worker's involvement erased all corporate responsibility. Here's why that matters. The system was not just dangerous, it was designed to make danger invisible. Accidents were blamed on worker carelessness, not unsafe conditions. Fatalities were recorded as isolated incidents, not patterns. Many injuries went undocumented entirely. If a man lost 3 fingers but kept working, no report was filed. The true toll was unknowable by design. Crystal Eastman would later discover something remarkable in her investigation of Pittsburgh's mills. 70% of workplace fatalities involved skilled tradesmen. These were not inexperienced newcomers making foolish mistakes. These were veterans who knew the machines intimately. They died anyway. When accidents occurred, mills often shut down just long enough to remove the body. Operations resumed within hours, sometimes within minutes. The message was clear. Men were replaceable. Production was not. And when disaster struck, it struck with a violence that even hardened mill workers struggled to describe. The accidents did not happen in the abstract. They happened to men with names, families, and futures that ended in seconds. In 1887, at a rolling mill in Hubbard, Ohio, an engineer named Griffith Phillips was performing routine maintenance. He was oiling an ore-crushing machine, a task he had done countless times before. His clothing caught on the spinning cog wheels. The gears pulled him in. A newspaper account described what remained. He was mangled out of all semblance of humanity, the flesh adhering to the cogs. No emergency stop existed. No guard separated Phillips from the machinery. The gears simply did what gears do. They rotated, and they did not distinguish between iron and bone. 2 years later in Youngstown, a roller named Charles Myers was working his shift when rain began to fall. Water dripped through gaps in the mill roof and contacted exposed molten iron. The reaction was instantaneous. When water meets metal at 2800 degrees, it flashes into steam and expands explosively. The blast crippled Myers for life. His career ended in a fraction of a second because no one had bothered to fix the roof. Could you imagine losing everything to a leaky ceiling? But individual accidents were only part of the horror. The real devastation came from catastrophic failures that killed multiple workers at once. In September 1872, the newly installed boilers at Brown, Bonnell and Company's rolling mill in Youngstown exploded without warning. The blast tore the boiler house literally to pieces. A 1-ton chunk of boiler metal flew a quarter-mile before landing. The boiler tender died instantly. The explosion threw immense pieces of machinery in every direction, scattering iron fragments across the mill yard like shrapnel. 9 years later, in January 1881, an even worse disaster struck the Allentown rolling mill in Pennsylvania. A faulty boiler detonated during operation. 14 men and boys were killed. 14 lives ended in a single moment because equipment maintenance cost money that owners refused to spend. Let me tell you something. That number haunts me. 14 included boys, children working alongside men in conditions that would kill them just as easily. The violence escalated with the scale of the machinery. In 1905, at a furnace complex in Struthers, Ohio, a 20-ton ladle of molten iron broke free from its supports and fell into a pool of water below. The resulting explosion was heard 10 miles away. One Slovenian worker was never found. His body had simply ceased to exist. Another man had his skull crushed by an unfastened pipe knocked loose by the blast. A third was covered in molten iron from his feet to his waist. Somehow, he survived. Could you imagine being coated in liquid metal and living to remember it? The Youngstown Vindicator reported in 1899 that workers witnessed colleagues literally roasted alive in pools of molten iron. Those were the paper's words, literally roasted alive. And the men who saw it happen were expected to return to work the next day. Same machines, same heat, same complete absence of protection. The psychological toll was incalculable, but no one was counting psychological damage. They were barely counting bodies. The carnage was not limited to individual mills or isolated incidents. When someone finally tallied the dead across an entire industrial region, the scale of the slaughter became impossible to ignore, and the numbers were staggering. In 1907, a young lawyer named Crystal Eastman arrived in Pittsburgh with a simple assignment: count the dead. What she found would change American labor law forever. Eastman spent over a year investigating industrial accidents in Allegheny County as part of the Pittsburgh Survey, a comprehensive study of urban industrial conditions funded by the Russell Sage Foundation. She documented every workplace death for an entire year and examined thousands of injury cases. The numbers were worse than anyone had imagined. 526 workers died in Allegheny County in a single year. 195 of them were steel workers. In a city of roughly 600,000 people, industrial accidents had become one of the leading causes of death. In the 1880s, fatal steel mill accidents accounted for 20% of all male deaths in Pittsburgh, 1 in 5. But the fatalities told only part of the story. Eastman catalogued the survivors as well. Her accounting was precise and devastating. 45 one-legged men, 100 hopeless cripples walking with crutch or cane for the rest of their lives, 45 men with a twisted, useless arm, 30 men with an empty sleeve, 20 men with but one hand, 60 with half a hand gone, 70 one-eyed men. That was the annual harvest from Pittsburgh's mills. No wonder, Eastman wrote, that to a stranger Pittsburgh streets are sad. The workers who fed the puddling furnaces faced perhaps the worst conditions of all. A puddler spent hours stirring 600 pounds of molten iron with a long rod, standing before temperatures that could blind and burn. The intense light of the furnace caused cataracts. The heat caused exhaustion. The gases caused lung disease. Few puddlers lived to see 40. Their bodies simply gave out. And when a man died or was maimed, his family received almost nothing. Eastman found that employers paid token sums at best, often requiring families to sign away all future legal claims in exchange. Immigrant families were particularly vulnerable. They had no union representation, no legal resources, and often no English. A father's death meant instant poverty. Widows took in boarders or sent children to work in the same mills that had killed their husbands. Here is what strikes me most. Each disaster was treated as an isolated incident. There was no centralized reporting, no pattern recognition, no institutional memory. A man died in Youngstown, and Pittsburgh learned nothing. A boiler exploded in Allentown, and Youngstown continued unchanged. The same failures repeated across hundreds of mills because no one was connecting the dots. Eastman connected them. Her report, Work Accidents and the Law, published in 1910, became a foundational document in the fight for workers' compensation. Pennsylvania would pass its own Workers' Compensation Act in 1915. Other states followed, but legislation moved slowly. Mills continued operating as they always had. Men continued dying. The question was no longer whether rolling mills were dangerous. The question was whether anything would change before the next generation was fed to the machines. Change came slowly, but it came. The first breakthrough was mechanical, not moral. In 1884, engineers at the Albany and Rensselaer Iron and Steel Company installed driven roller tables in front of their finishing rolls. Metal no longer had to be caught by hand. Machines moved it instead. The innovation worked so well that automatic feeding systems spread to roughing rolls shortly after. Human hands began retreating from the nip point. 9 years later, at Carnegie Steel's Homestead Works, the first electric motor was installed for roll table service. Electric power changed everything. It eliminated the dangerous belt and pulley systems that had claimed so many fingers and limbs. It allowed individual machines to operate independently. It made the mills faster, yes, but it also made them survivable. Safety engineering followed. Guards and enclosures went up around moving parts. Interlocks prevented machines from operating unless protective barriers were in place. Automatic shut-off mechanisms gave workers a chance to escape when something went wrong. Reversing systems allowed jams to be cleared without anyone reaching into the machinery. You might wonder why these obvious solutions took so long to implement. The answer is money. Not the cost of the equipment, the cost of accidents. Workers' compensation laws changed the math. New York passed its law in 1910. Pennsylvania followed in 1915. Most states had similar legislation by the 1920s. Suddenly, employers were financially responsible for injuries regardless of fault. Insurance companies began charging higher premiums for unguarded equipment. The economic incentive finally aligned with human welfare. The results were dramatic. In 1907, 195 steelworkers died in Allegheny County alone. By 1997, steelworker fatalities nationwide totaled 17. Not 1,700. 17. Modern rolling mills bear little resemblance to the death traps of the 19th century. They are automated, sensor-controlled, and operated from a distance. Workers rarely touch hot metal. Robots handle what humans once did with tongs and prayers. The machines still roll. They just stopped consuming the people who tend them. The rolling mills did not disappear. They evolved. The same machines that once pulled men into their gears now operate behind barriers, interlocks, and layers of protection that would have seemed miraculous to Griffith Phillips. But the lesson they taught came at an unimaginable price. The rolling mill taught industry a brutal truth. Progress measured only in tons shipped is progress paid for in lives lost. For decades, men fed their hands into machines that gave nothing back but wages too small to bury them. It took investigators counting bodies, reformers writing laws, and engineers building guards before the slaughter slowed. The machines still roll today, but the workers who run them come home. That was never guaranteed. It was fought for, legislated, and engineered into existence by people who refused to accept that production required sacrifice. The rolling mill did not have to be a monster. We just built it that way.